I stood there, facing over 200 hungry people, holding only 5 baguettes in a ripped plastic bag. The despair in that crowd's eyes was real, palpable. Crying children, adults with defeated faces, all waiting for me to perform some miracle, and that's exactly what happened. Those 5 loaves fed every single one of them, every single person, and there were still leftovers. I know it sounds impossible. I know your rational mind is rejecting this information right now, but I was there. I saw it. I lived it. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever the same after that day. My name is Raphael. I'm 42 years old, and for a long time I was a completely ordinary man. I worked as a sales manager at a building materials company, had my life organized, my plans mapped out, my routine well-defined. I woke up at 6 in the morning, had my coffee with 2 slices of buttered toast, went to work, came back at the end of the day, watched TV, and slept. Weekends were for resting, maybe hanging out with friends, nothing extraordinary. It was a predictable life, and I liked it that way. I was never a particularly religious person. I believed in God, yes, but in that distant way many people believe. I knew he existed, but he didn't interfere much in my practical life. I went to Mass occasionally, more out of family habit than genuine conviction. I prayed when I was scared, or when I needed something important, but the rest of the time, God was kind of tucked away in a corner of my mind. Like insurance you have, but hope you'll never need to use. Everything started to change about a year and a half ago, when I met Miss Hope. She was a lady in her 70s, who lived in the neighborhood where I worked, and every time I walked past her house to go to the bank, I saw her sitting in front of her house, always smiling, always greeting people. She had an infectious energy, you know, one of those people who brighten a room just by being there. One day, I was rushing to solve some problems at the bank when I tripped right in front of her house. It wasn't serious, just scraped my knee, but she immediately got up from her chair and came to help me. "Come here, son, let's take care of that scrape," she said, pulling me into her house. I couldn't refuse. Miss Hope's house was simple, but it had something special. The walls were full of images of saints, paintings with Bible verses, family photos. But what caught my attention most was the kitchen, small, but always smelling of good food, and with a table that seemed to seat a maximum of 4 people, but which she told me had once hosted up to 15 at the same time. While she cleaned my scrape with a mother's care, we started talking. I found out that Miss Hope had been a widow for 10 years, had 5 children scattered across the country, and dedicated her life to helping people in the neighborhood. "There are so many people in need around here," she told me, putting a bandage on my knee, "that I do what I can. Sometimes it's a plate of food, sometimes it's just a conversation, a shoulder to cry on." I asked how she managed to help so many people, since her house was so simple, and she gave a hearty laugh. "Son, when God wants things to happen, he always finds a way. The secret isn't having a lot, it's knowing how to share what little you have. And you'll see that when we share with love, it always multiplies." At the time, I thought it was just a nice phrase, one of those things religious people say. How could I imagine that months later, I would experience the real meaning of those words firsthand? I left her house that day, feeling different. I couldn't explain exactly what, but there was something about the way she spoke, the affection with which she treated me, the peace I felt in that environment, that kept playing on my mind. I started passing by her street more often, always greeting her, sometimes stopping for a quick chat. That's how I discovered the work she did. Every Thursday, Miss Hope prepared soup to distribute to the most needy families in the neighborhood. People of all ages came, from young children with their bowls, to elderly people, walking slowly with pots in their hands, and she served everyone with the same smile, the same patience, the same love. One day, without knowing why, I offered to help. "Miss Hope, wouldn't you like me to bring some ingredients for the soup? I can contribute." She looked at me with those bright eyes and said, "It would be a blessing, son, but the most important thing isn't what you bring, it's the heart with which you bring it." So I started participating in the Thursday soup. I brought vegetables, bought meat, helped peel potatoes, served people in line, and it was amazing to see how that changed something inside me. I began to know the stories behind those faces. Mrs. Mary, who raised 3 grandchildren alone after her daughter left. Mr. John, a retiree who shared his minimum pension with his sick wife. Young Carla, unemployed, who came to get food for her 2 young children. Each story touched me in a different way. I, who always complained when my credit card bill was high, began to realize how much I had and how blind I was to the suffering around me. It wasn't guilt, it was simply ignorance. I lived in my little world, focused on my problems, without noticing that right next to me were people facing difficulties much greater than mine. Miss Hope noticed this change in me. "You're awakening, son," she told me one day, as we washed the pots after the soup distribution. "God is preparing your heart for something bigger." I can feel it. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but I kept those words in my heart. And I'm so glad I did, because months later they made perfect sense. That year's winter was particularly harsh. Temperatures dropped far below normal, and many families already struggling found themselves in even more desperate situations. The demand for Thursday's soup tripled. If before it was about 50 people, now 150 showed up, sometimes more. Miss Hope was worried. We could no longer help everyone who needed it, and this left her distraught. "I can't let anyone go home empty-handed," she told me. "But how am I going to multiply the food?" That's when I decided to do something I'd never done before. I organized a fundraising campaign at my workplace. I explained to my colleagues about Miss Hope's work. I talked about the families we were helping, and I asked everyone to contribute what they could. The response was far better than I expected. In 1 week, we raised enough money to buy ingredients to feed 200 people. I was so proud, so excited about this accomplishment. I arrived at Miss Hope's house Thursday morning laden with bags, excitedly recounting everything. She listened attentively, smiling, but I noticed a certain worry in her eyes. "What's wrong, Miss Hope? Weren't you happy?" "I was, son, very happy. I'm just a little apprehensive. I received a call last night. The priest from the neighboring town's church asked if we could help a group of people who are in a very difficult situation. These are families who lost their homes in a fire and are sheltering in the church. Over 200 people, Raphael, and they're arriving here today at 1 o'clock. I felt the ground crumble beneath my feet. 200 people, in addition to those who would normally come. That would be almost 400 people to feed, and we had food for 200. I quickly did the math in my head. It wasn't going to work. "Miss Hope, it won't be possible. We don't have enough food. You should call the priest and explain that we can't receive these people today. Maybe next week, when we can better organize ourselves." She looked at me in that way. Only mothers know how to look when they want to teach their children something important. "Raphael, do you remember what I told you about multiplying? That when we share with love, it always multiplies. It's time for you to see that happen." We spent the whole morning cooking. We made the soup normally, for the 200 people we had planned for. But I was anxious, knowing it wouldn't be enough. How were we going to look those people in the eye and tell them there wasn't enough food for everyone? Around noon, while the soup was cooking, Miss Hope called me into the kitchen. "Raphael, can you go to the bakery and buy some bread, just to go with the soup?" "How many loaves, Miss Hope?" 5 baguettes should be fine." I looked at her without understanding. 5 loaves, for 400 people? She smiled her serene smile. "Trust me, son, 5 baguettes." I went to the bakery completely confused. 5 loaves for 400 people made no mathematical sense whatsoever. But there was something about Miss Hope's calmness that made me trust her. I bought the 5 baguettes, put them in the bag, and went back home. When I arrived, people were already starting to gather in front of the house. First came the usual families, then the buses with the people displaced by the fire began to arrive. In a short time, there was a crowd in the street. Men, women, children, elderly people, all with the same look of those who desperately needed help. This is where I need to pause my story, because if you're enjoying this account, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel. I share stories like this regularly, real testimonies, of people who have lived transformative experiences, and your subscription helps me continue to bring these messages of hope to more people. Believe me, you won't regret following these accounts that can touch your heart the same way they touched mine. Returning to the story, there I was, looking at that crowd, holding a bag with 5 loaves of bread, and knowing that we had soup for 200 people, when there were almost 400 waiting. Despair was taking over me. Miss Hope approached, and took my hand. "Let's start serving, Raphael. You're in charge of the bread." "But Miss Hope, trust," she said, handing me a knife. "Cut each loaf into small pieces, and give them to the people, a little piece for each one." I began to cut the first loaf, trying to make the pieces as small as possible. My hand trembled. I didn't know if from nervousness or disbelief. How were 5 loaves going to feed all those people? The first person in line was a child, a little girl about 6 years old, with big, curious eyes. I extended a small piece of bread to her, and she received it with a smile that melted my heart. "Thank you, uncle," she said, and went to join her parents. The second person, an elderly gentleman, bent over with the weight of the years. The third, a mother with a baby in her arms. And so I gave out small pieces of bread, person by person, trying to make it last as long as possible. But something strange began to happen. I cut and cut, but there always seemed to be bread in the bag. I passed 50 people, then 100, then 150, and there was still bread. It wasn't possible. I stopped for a moment, and looked inside the bag. There were still 3 whole loaves there, besides the pieces I was cutting. But that didn't make sense. I was sure I had already cut more than 2 complete loaves. I looked at Miss Hope, who was standing there beside me serving the soup with the same calm as always. She noticed my confused look, and just smiled, gesturing for me to continue. I continued cutting and distributing. 200 people, 250, 300. The line seemed endless, but the bread also seemed endless. Every time I thought it was going to run out, there was more bread in the bag. At that moment, I started to feel something different, a strange energy running through my body, an emotion I had never experienced before. It was as if something bigger was happening, something my rational mind couldn't process, but my heart recognized as true. The people receiving the pieces of bread looked at me with deep gratitude, but there was something more in their eyes. It was as if they also felt that this wasn't normal, that something special was happening. An elderly woman, upon receiving her piece of bread, took my hand and said, "God bless you, son. I can feel His presence here." Her words sent chills down my spine. When the last person in line finally received their piece of bread, I was in shock. I had fed 437 people. I counted them one by one, and when I looked inside the bag, there were still 2 whole loaves left. My legs went weak. I sat on the sidewalk, looking at the bag, trying to understand what had happened. It wasn't possible. 5 loaves couldn't feed over 400 people and still have leftovers. It was physically and mathematically impossible. Miss Hope approached and sat beside me. "Now you understand what I meant about multiplying when you share with love. Miss Hope, what happened here? How is this possible?" She was silent for a moment, looking at the people who were still there, talking, some still eating, children playing in the street. "Raphael, have you ever heard of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes?" Of course I had heard of it. It was one of the most famous stories in the Bible, Jesus feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But but those are Bible stories, Miss Hope. They happened 2,000 years ago. She smiled in that maternal way of her. "And who says God stopped performing miracles 2,000 years ago? Do you think He changed? That He lost His power? Or that He stopped loving His children?" I fell silent, processing all of that. My rational mind struggled against what I had just experienced. How to explain scientifically what happened? How to fit that into my organized and predictable worldview? But why me, Miss Hope? I'm not a particularly religious person. I'm not a priest. I'm not a saint. Exactly for that reason, son. God doesn't choose perfect people. He chooses willing hearts. And your heart was willing to serve, to give of yourself. to trust. Even with fear, even without understanding, you trusted. We sat there for over an hour, talking about faith, about purpose, about the mysteries of life that our limited minds cannot comprehend. Miss Hope told me she had witnessed other small miracles over the years. When you truly put yourself at the service of love, you become a channel for extraordinary things to happen, she told me. That day, I went home completely transformed. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I replayed the scene hundreds of times in my head, trying to find a logical explanation, a trick, something that made sense. But there was no explanation. There was only the reality of what I had experienced. In the days that followed, I began to research miracles, the multiplication of food, similar experiences around the world. I discovered that throughout history, many people have reported similar situations. They weren't crazy, they weren't liars. They were ordinary people who, in moments of extreme need, and with hearts open to service, witnessed inexplicable things. From that day on, my life changed completely, not in the sense that I became a fanatic evangelist, or that I gave up everything to become a missionary, but it changed in essence. I began to see the world with different eyes. I began to perceive God's presence in the small things, in the coincidences that are not coincidences, in the encounters that seem casual but transform lives. I continued working at the company, kept my routine, but now, there was a different purpose in everything I did. On Thursdays, I continued helping Miss Hope with the soup, and curiously, food never ran out again. There weren't other miracles as evident as the one with the loaves, but the food always worked out. It was always enough. Sometimes there were even leftovers. I also started helping other people in different ways. A coworker who was going through financial difficulties, an elderly neighbor who needed company, children in the neighborhood who needed help with their studies. I discovered that when you have an open heart to serve, opportunities appear everywhere. 6 months after the miracle of the loaves, Miss Hope called me for a serious conversation. "Raphael, I want to tell you something. That day, when you bought the 5 loaves, I prayed, asking God to use your hands as His instrument. I knew He was going to do something special, but even I didn't imagine it would be so evident. You knew something was going to happen. I felt it. After so many years serving God, you learn to recognize when He's preparing something. I saw how you were changing, how your heart was opening, how you were truly making yourself available to love, and I knew God was going to use that in some way." I asked her if she wasn't surprised when she saw the loaves multiplying, and she gave a hearty laugh. "Son, when you've lived with God for so many years, you learn that He's a specialist in doing the impossible. What surprised me wasn't the miracle itself, it was how you reacted. I saw your faith born in that moment, and she was right. My faith truly was born that day, not a blind faith, based only on doctrines or traditions, but a living faith, based on personal experience, a faith that allows me to accept that there are mysteries in this world, that our limited minds cannot explain, but that our hearts recognize as true. Today, almost a year after that day, I can say that I am a completely different person. I haven't changed my profession, I haven't become a religious leader, but I have changed my way of life. I wake up every day knowing that I can be an instrument of love and transformation in someone's life. I still have the 2 loaves of bread left over from that day. They're kept in my freezer, in a plastic bag. Sometimes people ask me why I haven't eaten them or thrown them away, and I explain that they are my physical reminder that God still performs miracles, that He is still present and active in our lives. Miss Hope continues to make her Thursday soup, and I continue to help. She told me the other day that she feels God still has bigger plans for me, that miracle was only the beginning. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm willing to trust, willing to serve, willing to be used as an instrument of love. One thing I've learned on this journey is that miracles don't happen to impress or to prove the existence of God. They happen to transform hearts, to awaken faith, to show that love is the most powerful force in the universe. and that when we truly put ourselves at the service of that love, we become capable of things we never imagined possible. If you're listening to this story and wondering if this really happened, I understand your doubt. I would also doubt it if I were just a listener. But I was there. I lived it. I held those loaves in my hands, saw the bag empty and fill again, looked into the eyes of each of those 437 people who were fed. More important than believing or not believing my story is you asking yourself, what is your purpose? How can you be an instrument of love in someone's life? What small miracles can you make happen through your willingness to serve? Because in the end, that's what I learned. That miracles aren't just inexplicable supernatural events. Miracles are also acts of love that transform lives. They are words of comfort that arrive at the right moment. They are outstretched hands to help those in need. They are hearts that open to receive and to give. And maybe, just maybe, when we perform these small daily miracles with true love, God allows us to participate in greater miracles, like that day when 5 loaves fed multitudes, and my life was transformed forever. Today, when I pass by the street where it all began, I still see Miss Hope sitting in front of her house, smiling and greeting people, and I know that there, in that simple house, with that extraordinary woman, I learned the true meaning of faith, not the faith that accepts everything passively, but the faith that acts, that serves, that trusts, and that allows itself to be surprised by the mysteries of God's love. This is my story, real, true, transformative, and I hope that in some way, it can touch your heart and awaken in you the same certainty that awakened in me, that God still performs miracles, and that each of us can be a part of them.